Welcome, friends, to this episode of the Sync Your Life podcast. I am so grateful to be welcoming back Dr. Shahana Alibhai. This is not her first time on the show, so I will make sure to link up in the show notes the first interview that we did because we touched on so many great things. We talked about mental health, especially mental health, not only in ourselves as women, but in our youth. We also touched on postpartum OCD. We talked about self-awareness, and we really only started to scratch the surface. So I knew I wanted to have Dr. Shahana back to talk more about self-awareness, talk more about mental health and all the things that are facing us today as a society and as women in society. So I'm obliged to welcome back my friend Dr. Shahana. If you could just, tell our audience like who you are, a little bit of your backstory in case they haven't listened to that first episode. I'd love for you to share that.
Oh, for sure. It's such a pleasure to be back for this round too. So, for me, I always talk about this idea that if you were at a dinner party, how would you introduce yourself? And it's always that those top line things, yes, I'm a mom of 3 boys under the age of 7. That's probably the first definition of myself. I'm a family physician. I practice here in British Columbia with a focus on youth mental health. We run one of the largest youth health centers in our entire province with 500 new patient visits a month, which is crazy when you think about the need. And that's for anywhere between the ages of 12 and 24. I'm also a wife to a chiropractor that has his own business. And I think like many of us, we're trying to keep our head above water. We're trying to do the things that need to get done while still fulfilling the need of what is in your heart, right? And for me, it was the first time I ever got on stage when I gave my TEDx talk 3 years ago after the birth of my 3rd son, that I was on that stage and I thought, you know what, if I don't do this now, I'm never going to. There's never going to be the right time. Everyone kept telling me, well, wait till the kids are in school, then you'll have more time. Or wait till this happens and then you'll have more time. And I think as many moms and dads that are much wiser than me always tell me, is that there is never the right time, because as they get older, there's activities. And as they get older, there's actually bigger problems, right? That sometimes a hug and a treat don't always solve too. So that's kind of what launched this idea of me as a speaker. But what solidified it even more was that it was one thing to preach to my patients about mental health, and it was a very different thing for me to live it as a patient. And that all came to unfold after the birth of my first son. And it wasn't just the run-of-the-mill anxiety and depression. It was coming face to face with a secret that I had hid from myself, my husband, my family, since the age of 4 or 5. And the worst thing about a secret is that you know that something is wrong, but I didn't have the words. I didn't know what was wrong. So that left a wide open space in my brain and in my heart to feel like something was inherently deficient in me. And that now I understand the dialogue that many patients have is that if I ever told this to anybody, I would be met with judgment, stigmatism, and that awful look of, oh, like I don't get that. I don't understand that. And the thing that I had to come face to face with was a subtype of OCD, which I now have the words and I now know what it is, which is called pure O, or just pure obsessional OCD, where you just have the awful, bring you to your knees, intrusive thoughts without the compulsion. So nobody recognizes it, and it can go hidden. And of course, the postpartum period, like I always say, is the most fertile period, that everything that you've stuffed way, way, way down underneath the earth will find its way to resurface. And that's exactly what happened to me. And I ended up with postpartum OCD, not the compulsions, just the intrusive thoughts. And we've talked about that with our first episode. So, I think it's one thing to really tell people, tell your story and share your story and be open and seek counseling. That sounds lovely on paper, and it's so easy to say. But when you're in it, when you have to open up to a healthcare professional and say the words that you thought you would never say, for me, it was the intrusive thought, like, could I hurt or harm my child? That is the thing that literally would bring any woman or man to their knees. And that was the road that I had to walk. And it was all of it. It was medication, it was psychiatry, it was counseling, it was sitting in offices, and with a big V stamp to your forehead for vulnerability. So it's changed my outlook on mental health. And what I always say is that it's not that I had OCD, I have OCD, right? I have pure obsessional OCD. Just actually 2 weeks ago, I was crying my eyes out to my husband saying, I can't believe this has come back. But that's the thing with mental health. If you look over your shoulder wondering where it's coming, it will always be there. You have to learn to live with it to a certain degree, to have the tools, to find the tools. But I think it's so different, as we know, than a physical injury. It's not a cut that's automatically going to stitch itself together, right? It might be something that you have to learn to live with, and that is okay.
Yeah, I wrote down the words, is not was, right? It's part of who you are and not necessarily something that's just existed before. Yeah, your story is so powerful. And I love that, I think you have this unique perspective in that not only do you work with people sort of on the other side of the table, right? You are the person who asks the questions and learns the story and whether it's diagnosis or treats or whatever, but you're also the person who has lived a story. And I think that's such a unique thing because it gives you this perspective on the reality of what's going on, right? For these individuals that you're meeting with. We on the previous episode we talked about postpartum OCD. We talked about more specifics regarding that, but I felt like we really only scratched the surface on this idea of self-awareness. Obviously most of my listeners are women who are interested in hormone health and women who are maybe feeling a little off and they're looking for guidance in that. And so self-awareness, whether it's related to your fitness or your mental health or whatever, is always step one. But I felt like we just scratched the surface on that before we had to wrap things up. So I want to start there today for the sake of this sort of, sequel. And I want to just ask you, let's kind of touch on that self-awareness again, and then we'll go from there into maybe a deeper look at what it looks like to retrain the brain.
Absolutely. So, yeah, and you said it perfectly there too. So, I think growing up, many of us, we learn about the importance of training our body, but it wasn't until my own story, my own journey, that I thought, if only I had bolsters, if only I had the cushion, if only I had the knowledge to say, well, this is how you actually can train your brain, because we live on the fly. Something happens to us, we have a reaction, we move on. Something else happens to us, we have another reaction, we move on. There's little retrospection in terms of, oh, well, why did I feel that way? And what emotion did that bring up for me? And why? Right. And I think any of us who have toddlers at home, the key skill when you look at a toddler is that of curiosity, right? They're not judging themselves for falling down. They're not judging themselves for making a mess, although we might be. But it's the idea that they are curious. And that is one of the key elements of self-awareness, is how can you train yourself to be curious and not critical? How can you train yourself to be curious and not critical of yourself? But the difficult part is that critique, that voice that puts you down, is not your own voice. Were not born with a voice when you were literally an infant to say, well, why did you soil your diaper? Like, that doesn't happen. That voice is your parents' voice. It's your grandparents' voice. It's your teacher's voice, your coach's voice, your partner's voices, all amalgamating into what you think your own voice is, right? So part of that, to generate and actually come up with that curious mind, is to figure out, well, whose voice is being critical to you, right? And that does take some deep diving to go, okay, well, it was the time that I was between 7 to 10 where everything I did, I was just put down. And these are the voices that I hear in my youth. It's this idea that their parents, I just last week, there was a youth that was just absolutely sobbing to me saying, and I told him, I said, I'm proud of you. I'm proud of everything that you've done. And he looked at me and I said, I wish that was enough. He's like, the only person I want to be proud of me is my mom. That's it. And his mom couldn't care less about his existence. From the day he was born, he looked too much like her ex-husband, and he became the target of all of the difficulties that she had ever gone through. So, he was coming to terms with this, that his identity from the moment he was born was not enoughness. You are not enoughness, right? And that takes a while to unpack too. So when it comes to training your brain, the two big components that I have come up with is understanding the science of emotion, because it is a science. understanding the idea of what are emotions, what do emotions tell you, why are you having an emotion, and what do you do with an emotion? That's that bucket. And the second is the self-awareness piece. So if we start with the end in mind with the idea of self-awareness, this is the idea that, I talk to patients sometimes and I always say, well, you have your own inner roommate. And they kind of look at me going, like, what are you talking about? Like, where is this inner roommate? And it's this idea that all of us have this conversation that's constantly going on in our head, for better or for worse. But if you don't tune into that radio station, if you actually don't listen, you will never be privy to that. And it's from there that we have to understand that you are not your thoughts. As somebody with pure OCD, God forbid, I hope I'm never my thoughts. And I really come to appreciate that now. You are not your emotions. You are not your thoughts. But dare I say, you are your perspective. You are your perspective, right? We've met and we've heard the worst of the worst stories. Take Viktor Frankl, right? The idea that you can be a Holocaust survivor in the concentration camps, but it was his perspective that kept him alive, right? So that you are not your thoughts, you are not your feelings, but you can be and you should be your perspective. And that's what takes the training. But before you can even gather perspective, you have to be aware of that inner roommate. And that takes practice. And I came up with the simple little acronym N2S2 that we can explore a little bit today. And the first N for that is just noticing. We practice self-abandonment. You go to a party, I'm fine, I'm good, I'm okay. No, you're not. And part of it is that nobody has the time to listen to you because we just are so busy in our day. Even think about your spouse. When's the last time you really said, like, how are you? And part of that, the trick, if you want to be a good spouse, a good partner, a good brother, a good sister, is ask the extra question. Someone says, I'm good. Why? What made you good today? I do this with your kids. Ask one extra question, and you'll be amazed to see, oh, I'm fine. School went great. What was so great about it? What did you do? Probe. And that takes, your cup has to be somewhat full in order for you to take that on. But that's what I call conscious compassion. Conscious compassion is a way that you can actually, we talked about that you are your perspective. That's a way of building perspective. If you hone in conscious compassion, this idea that because compassion actually means, the etymology of the word means to suffer with. But this idea that you're actually going out of your way to find out truly how somebody's doing. But if you don't have a person like that in your life, then you can do this yourself by just simply noticing what's going on in my body and realizing that the mind and the body aren't so detached as you might think, right? Some people find this really helpful with colors. They might feel, I know when I'm driving into my driveway to park my car, I suddenly see it's like those oranges and those reds, and I can feel it. I can feel it in myself because I'm so nervous to walk into my house with my 3 kids. I know what's waiting for me on the other side. Some people feel it in temperatures, right? They can feel that clammy feeling about that they're quite sweaty, that they're warm inside, right? So you can do it with colors, you can do it with temperatures, right? So it doesn't always have to be, notice how you're feeling. You can do it in these other ways. A great way sometimes is, for those who have ever played the piano before or a musical instrument, there's a metronome, right? That kind of keeps track of how fast or slow you play. And I remember my teacher cranking up the metronome, like, play faster, play faster, play faster. And that's what my heart rate does. That's what my heart rate does when I know I'm about to see an angry patient, or when I'm going to walk into my house, or when I maybe even have to give a presentation. I can feel it. Here we go. So these are all little tricks that you can use. But you might tell me, okay, so I've noticed that something, and it doesn't have to be, you don't have to write an essay on this. You just have to say something feels, I feel safe. I don't feel safe. I feel right. Something doesn't feel quite right. As if you're trying on jeans that are too tight. That's all you have to do. That's it for N. The second N becomes the naming. Now give it a name. Give it a name, right? This can be hard. I think we might have touched on this last time, but a study was done where people had 3 adjectives: mad, sad, and glad. That doesn't tell me very much, right? Give it a name. This is really helpful for me personally. If you want a great app, it's 99 cents. Go online. It's called Mood Meter. Mood Meter. It's amazing to use with your kids as well. So much of the time, I think I'm angry. I'm not angry. I'm overwhelmed. I'm overwhelmed. I'm scared. I'm depleted. These are the words that we need to start using, right? I always call anger a fear with a touch of spice, right? Maybe it's not anger. So many of the times you're just, when you feel done, like I just have nothing more to give you, depleted. And that the word depleted, what does it actually mean? That you have nothing more to give. So then that you need to fill yourself up. Then you can take action. But words matter. Words matter. And we call it name it to tame it. And the minute that you can tell somebody, look, I'm feeling depleted, suddenly for you, you're like, I took ownership of that. Like that's actually who I am in this moment right now. And that's okay. Right? Then we bring in the S. The first S is the story. And this is the most powerful one. For me, I tell a great story in my head. I sell myself the story every day is how I'm the mom that does everything. How I'm the mom that if I wasn't here, nothing would run without me. How how I'm trying to see patients and then build my own business. And I wish somebody would just cook dinner for once and nobody takes care of me. And, I'm good at it. I always say the stories you tell yourself are the stories you sell yourself. And I am the best salesperson you'll ever meet, as are you, as are you, as are you, right? So, but remember, the stories are not necessarily your stories. They're the stories of your mom who was complaining about your father, right? They're the story of your father who was complaining about the fact that he never had any money. And now you think that there's a scarcity of money in the world, right? It's all of that. Stories are the conversations that you've heard as a child and the imprints that those have on you. And that takes counseling and therapy to tease those apart. But all I'm asking for you is can you poke? I think as kids, have you ever done this before where you kind of poke holes into saran wrap and see the steam come out, that sort of thing too? Can you poke one hole in your story? Just one. And it's hard. And I'm not saying it's not true. I do a lot in the home. I know I do. But would this home collapse without me? Probably not. Probably not. Am I the be all and end all? Probably not. Right? But that's a really hard thing to admit to me and to admit to myself too. And then the last S is shift. How are you going to shift? And do you want to shift? That's the difference in terms of this little acronym that I've come up with, and a lot of the positive psychology that's out there is this need that you must feel good all the time. No, you don't. No, you don't. Do you want to shift? Do you want to keep feeling overwhelmed and depleted? Go for it. Go for it. That's fine. Feel it in your body. Feel sorry for yourself. Do that. That's fine. But sometimes you might say, you know what? I'm going to set it for the next 3 hours. I'm going to feel down in the dumps and miserable. And guess what? Once you give yourself permission, it won't even last that long usually. But don't force yourself to always have to feel good. It was hilarious the other day. My husband had some issues at his office and he's like, you know what? I'm grateful. I am grateful that this happened and it's a bet. I said, just give yourself a second. He's like, yeah, I know it really sucks. So it's okay. Feel what you're going to feel. But shifting is breaking the inertia. How do you actually break that inertia? If you've seen Newton's cradle, right? When you kind of hit that one ball, all the rest kind of move. How are you going to take that one ball and move it? And sometimes that requires big action. And I've got lots of different methods on my website, but some are actually change the environment. If you're feeling really stuck and really overwhelmed, for me, if I spend a lot of time in my kitchen, I find it really hard to move away from the kitchen because so much has to get done. And if I'm not doing the dishes, no one is. And walk away, go outside, change the environment from where you are feeling that difficult emotion, right? Go into the playroom, go into upstairs, go wherever, but change the environment too. Play with temperatures. That's why there's so much evidence for a cold shower, for a cold drink, for a warm cup of tea. It's very hard to have a panic attack and be holding 3 ice cubes at the same time, right? That's one of the reasons why we use that as a technique, right? A great one that I was actually just doing on the way here is I call it zoom out. Like literally my son's playing with cameras right now and we're looking at like zoom out, because you feel like you are the star in your own show and only your show matters. Well, look around you. Like, you don't always need to compare yourself to others, but sometimes it kind of helps. Right now, I've got a pack and I've got tons of work to do and I'm feeling, oh, it's all me, me, me. And I've got thousands of examples of people who are 1,000 times worse off, right?
Mm-hmm.
So give yourself some perspective. So those are just a couple, but hopefully that kind of outlines a little bit of a schematic people can walk through to build that self-awareness and curiosity.
Yeah, that's so good. I love this N2S2 acronym because I made some notes here, and one of the things that I wanted to come back to is, ironically, you're the second person who's been a voice in my ear this week about this idea of our story or the narrative that we tell ourselves. And I listened to Brooke Castillo's Life Coach School podcast, and she just did an episode recently called Power Sentences. I'll make sure to link it up in the show notes. But she was talking about how each of us have what she calls a power sentence that is running our life and giving us the results we're getting. So whether it has to do with our career, our relationships, whatever, that's what results mean. And so she's saying that discovering what that is often such a journey, because like as a life coach herself, she talked about how, people often say what they think is the sentence that's running their life. And it's usually the one that they want to be running their life, but it's usually different than the one that's actually running their life. Right. And that comes back to this idea of limiting self-beliefs. Like, what is this, this oftentimes the story that we're telling ourselves is something that's limiting us from our true potential. I've been on that journey myself recently. It's just sort of uncovering like, what is it that's holding me back in these certain areas, and really having to be honest with myself and say, okay, and you were just saying, you're the best at telling yourself a story, right? Like almost selling yourself on why things are or are not working. I'm the same way. And as you said, we all are for our own stories. And so I just wanted to say that, because it's, obviously if it's been repeated in the universe, then it means it's meant to be shared. So this idea that we have a power sentence, or we have a story, we have this sort of narrative that is governing the results that we're seeing in our life. But I think the most powerful thing that you had to say was actually, do you want to shift? And I want to make sure we pause on that just briefly, because as a fitness instructor and as a nutritionist and as somebody who people come to running saying, I need help, right? I need to be healthier. I need to be healthier for my kids. I need to lose this weight. I need this and that. A lot of times I really do. It sounds so silly to say, but a lot of times it really does come down to, how bad do you want to make the shift? How bad are you willing, or, what steps are you willing to take? Do you really want to do the work to make that shift? Right. And so I think that just needed an extra pause, because I think it's so, so important.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I think, and it gives you freedom. It gives you that room to breathe a little bit if you're not always forcing yourself to be in a state or situation that your body is not ready for too. And, I think just in that gives you a little bit of a pause to say, you know what, when I'm ready, I will. And what the ironic part is that you end up getting there a lot sooner when you do give yourself permission, right? That's the ironic part for sure.
Yeah, most definitely. So I want to talk about, if we can learn to become aware of ourselves and we can learn sort of what our nuances are, right? What are, I like to say, our trends, like what do I do in my life that tends to be a trend? For me, I'm very controlling. I like to control my environment. I like to control my schedule. I like to control, everything. And anytime I'm feeling out of control, or where it's just simply not in my control, is where my body goes into panic mode. That's when my body says, it's not safe. right? Because you're not in control. So I see that as a trend for myself, just to share. But I think that, picking up on those trends is key, and that self-awareness is key. But how do we move from, I like how you've used this phraseology before of, this is who I am in this moment.
Yes.
How do we move from that self-awareness of, this is who I am in this moment, to a place of self-love?
Yeah. That's a great question too. So there's a great little story that I sometimes give in my keynote presentations about, a venture capitalist named Rick Elias, who was on a flight that many of us know now as the flight that landed in the Hudson River, piloted by Captain Sully Sullenberger. And before we get to the actual, now that you know this, you know that the actual end was fine. But of course, for the passengers on that plane, they had no idea. And on this plane, the lights come up and they say, brace for impact. So he gives this story about how he looks around, and he looks around and sees people hugging each other. He sees people crying, and he sees people praying. And he goes on to say that in those 90 seconds, he did none of that. In fact, what he did was so surprising and so remarkable to me. It's always stuck with me. And what he did was he hugged himself and he said, I love you. I love you. I love you, to himself. And of course, 90 seconds later, everybody walked off, and they had this amazing story to tell and a new lease on life. And that story's always really stuck with me, because it's this idea that literally, are you going to wait till the 90 seconds before your presumptive death to admit and share with yourself that you love yourself? At the same time, though, I think we live in a world where self-love has been propagated to be the antidote for all badness. And reflecting on that, I almost think that we have to take it a step lower than that, in the sense that it's not self-love, it's self-acknowledgement. That is the key. That is the key. So that's one of the principles that I talk about when I give my talk, this idea that we often equate acknowledgement with leniency. That if I acknowledge myself, I'm giving myself permission to be lenient, to actually relax, to take my foot off the gas, because I've acknowledged myself. And that's exactly the opposite. Measuring your success backwards, looking at how far you've come, giving yourself permission to acknowledge yourself, actually is the fuel that you need. And that, in fact, builds that curiosity and decreases that critiquing voice that we were talking about at the onset of the episode too. So that, for me, is that's the segue between self-awareness and self-love, is self-acknowledgement. So one of the slides that I often reflect on is this idea, and it just says, I see you. I see you as a working mom. I see you trying to take care of elderly parents. I see you struggling with finances. I see you. And I think so many of us live our life not feeling seen at all by the people that apparently love us, or even by ourselves. So one of the first steps that when I talk to a patient, and oftentimes as a physician, I'm not a clinical counselor, I'm a physician. My job is to diagnose you, to treat you with medication. But this, I can't help but not stick on this piece that I often will tell the youth, do you love yourself? And they'll kind of go like, they'll use many expletives, but they'll say no, like, no, I don't. And I say, well, can you just outline for me how far you've come? And when I've heard where they've come from to now, they even go, oh yeah, like, that's pretty incredible. That's pretty incredible. So shedding a spotlight on that leads to the pathway of loving yourself.
Yeah, you have a way with words for sure. I love the way you just said that. I know that we had the chance to sort of talk about, this idea of mental well-being, and we've talked both in this episode and in the previous episode about identifying emotions. I believe I might have mentioned this on the last one, but in case I didn't, a great children's book that we reference often is called In My Feelings. And I'll make sure I link it up in the show notes, but it is so good. And it actually uses colors. Each page is a different color and it identifies different emotions, which is so good. But, this idea of mental health and emotional health, though, I'm wondering, we talked about this previously, but I want to make sure we bring it to the forefront for our listeners. Do you consider that to be the same thing? And if not, why?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, you know, if we rewind a little bit, we talked about this idea of how to train your brain, breaking it down into the science of emotions. Just even by saying that, realizing that emotions actually are there for a reason. They leave clues. They let you understand yourself. And then of course the self-awareness piece that we dived into right now as well. But a lot of the times we will look and hear the words emotional health and mental health synonymously. And I think what I've come to realize is that they're both equally important ingredients, but they're not one and the same things. The ironic part, though, is that if I give you the image of an actual image, and if we break that down into pixels, that to me is what emotional health is. It's all those little pixels that finally make up the picture. And the picture is mental health. The pixels are the idea that you have a million chances every day to work on your emotional health, to improve your emotional flexibility and adaptability, and become what I call an emotional ninja. But the final picture that somebody, even yourself, will see in front of you, that's what we often deem as mental health. And unfortunately, and I hate this, is that oftentimes when I use the words mental health, our brain goes to the idea that it's a diagnosable mental health condition. And those are not the same things. Mental health can just be your mental health, like how you are dealing with everything on a day-to-day basis. But I strongly believe that the better grasp and the better curiosity you have about your emotional health, the stronger and more resilient your mental health will be. So they are closely linked. But I often would look at my patients and feel like, where is this tsunami of mental health, in my case, diagnosable mental health conditions coming from? And I'd feel like I'm constantly picking up the pieces and having the same conversations with a different face. How could this be? And the reason is that these kids, they're still kids to me, 15, 16, 17, 18. They've had 18 years of practice in really often difficult situations, but not understanding at all what or how to deal with their emotional health. And now they come to me and they can't leave their room. They can't go to school. They're constantly suicidal, right? So I see the picture, but I want to work at the pixel level.
Yeah. Yeah. And it makes me think too, you know, especially given sort of the state that we're in coming out of the pandemic and everything. I know it makes me wonder sometimes, you know, like how much there is so much more focus nowadays, especially thanks to, I think it was the Olympics a few years ago, right? There's this focus now on mental health. And I use this as an example just because most people have heard of it, right? But like the Simone Biles situation with the gymnastics event and her saying, no, I can't do this because of, it doesn't even matter because society doesn't need to know why, but for my mental health reasons, right? And I think that it is coming to the forefront, but I love this angle of identifying the difference between emotional and mental health and how emotional health really is sort of like the building block to this. I'm curious your thoughts though on, you know, how much of our story that we tell ourselves and how much of our overall emotional well-being, in your opinion, based on what you've seen, both through your own story and through working with adolescent youth, you know, what do you think, or what type of role does parenting play in that? The reason I ask is because earlier when you were talking, I was thinking of when you were talking about the story that you tell yourself, I was thinking about this question that has come up through, I know Tony Robbins uses it at his live event. And it's a powerful question. And it actually brought up, it's a powerful question. And it actually brought up some questions for myself years ago when I heard it the first time, which is, which parent did you crave attention from the most? And it kind of comes back to that story of what you were just sharing with one of your clients. But I know for me, that question helped me uncover so much about myself, right? It helped me determine like, oh, this is why I'm wired the way I'm wired. And this is why I crave XYZ, right? This is why I'm always driving to the next thing and I'm pushing to the next thing because I'm craving that recognition or that attention from that person. So I'm just curious, like how much of that is present in the people that you speak with?
I think it's a huge huge factor. I think we don't talk about it enough. And I think what we need to realize is even the absence. A lot of the patients that I have don't have any parents. They have come through the foster care system. They're on an independent youth agreement. So all they have known is nothingness from a parental point of view and abandonment as well. So you have that at one extreme of the spectrum. And then you have parents who can obviously be doing the absolute best job they can be doing, but inadvertently they're passing on their own biases, their own insecurities, their own guilt, their own aspirations to their kids to say, here, take all of my stuff and run with it, go. And that's how we have intergenerational, for lack of a better word, trauma, or even expectations, if you want to put it that way too. So I think if you look on both ends of the spectrums, this is an area that just, you can't ignore it. You just can't ignore it. And going back to that 15-year-old who was sobbing in front of me, just working 2 jobs, left his house at the age of 13, ran away to go live with his biological father, and saying none of that mattered because all he wanted was one phrase from his mom saying, I love you. That's it. He's like, it would take it all away. But when do you learn to say, you know what? I can't wait for you to do your healing, right? But you tell that to a 4, 5, 6-year-old, they don't want to eat that. That's too young, right? So you are now, I always talk about this, is that these youth are wearing the paper cuts of their parents. You're literally wearing it. And when do you learn to shed that? When do you learn to heal their wounds and your own wounds? And that's a long process. And sometimes the wounds are very deep, very deep. And it's hard to, and without a help of a trained professional and lots of counseling and lots of support, they can see the other side of that. But that also takes maturity, right? Our prefrontal cortex is finally developed at the age of 21. These kids have been subject to this stuff well before their maturation. So it's really hard.
Yeah. I mean, I had to ask the question because it seems like, I've interviewed so many trauma-informed therapists, and even had the chance to go deep with someone recently that will be coming to the podcast soon, but we go deep into this idea of like epigenetic therapy and how we pass trauma on from generation to generation. And it's so true, right? I mean, you can see it in the small things. I mean, my husband and I talk about how, because his parents didn't necessarily, they never got what they wanted as children, right? There was, finances were tight, like all these things, were the case. And so then when Chris and his brother were born, it became, you can have whatever you want because we didn't get anything we wanted, right? And so it's like so much of who we are is shaped by those things that have sort of been in place in previous generations. And whether it's trauma or something minor, it doesn't matter. Like those things are so factored into who we are and our identity and all of that. So good. I want to ask you the question because I don't think I had the chance to ask last time. Obviously, as always, we want to point people to the right help. So like if they need help, there's that question, but also just what do you really feel like is the first best step to identifying this self-awareness, whether it's most likely the mom listening to this show who's thinking, I'm going to lose my mind, right? We were just talking before this, like as a mom, like there are many times you feel like you're going to lose it, right? And so whether it's that or dealing with something that's diagnosable or whatever, like regardless, what's the first step?
Yeah. And I think the biggest disservice that I could give to a mom was to add something else onto your plate and say, you know what, now you must meditate for 20 minutes a day in order to do this. Like, no. We don't do that. I remember looking at the book, like, the 5 a.m. club. And when my sons were really little going, I'm already up at 5, but I'm breastfeeding. Like I'm not doing my hour of power or any of that, so definitely not adding something else to your plate. Do you know what the easiest, simplest thing that you can do to get started right away is that we all probably drive a fair distance, picking, dropping, doing, just be quiet. Don't put the radio on. Don't put a podcast on. It's hard for me. I love podcasts. Just be quiet. Don't put anything on and see, just follow, just like a rabbit, follow where your mind goes. Don't judge it. Just see. It's thinking about what to make for dinner. It's thinking about what you need to wear. It's thinking about what the kids need for their school. Follow it along. And then try as you're driving to say that, can you start to quiet the mind a little bit? And that's it. That's the easiest first step, is just getting comfortable with the idea of being a bit quiet. And that sounds like maybe a cop-out answer, but it's one of the hardest things I personally still struggle with. Another thing that you can do, which is super simple while driving, is if you're finding yourself feeling a bit low, I call it, it's just called traffic light to traffic light. So I call it a gratitude dump. It's just from a green light to green light. I want you to think of everything in your life that is bringing you so much joy and abundance and that you're so grateful for. And if the kids are in the back, I play the game with them. And just from green light to green light, we just do this and see how many we can actually name too. These are small little things that, because let's be honest, when you have kids, there's very little time that you don't have kids with you, right? So if you can get some of this stuff done, or these practices, and hopefully even by listening to this at some points too, you can start to say, there is hope, right? We're not aiming for a perfect life. We don't want a perfect life. That we wouldn't, I always say a picture would have no depth if you didn't color with the darker colors. You need that, right? And I also encourage you, use the app Mood Meter. It's really helpful. You just have to look, and if you can label an emotion, that's it, you're done. But pick the right name, and then you can start to figure out a pattern that, you know what, I tend to be in this emotional arena a lot. And then you can go on to step 2.
Yeah. I used to joke around when I was meeting with my life coach weekly. I used to say, I feel like the purpose of these appointments often for me was just to gain clarity on the emotion that I was feeling. And then because we were meeting so often, picking up on the patterns that I was repeating, right? Like, this is the way that you just said it beautifully with, like, this is the arena that I find myself in. How can I change that? Or, what are the triggers that are leading me to that? And how can I change that? So good. Since you mentioned gratitude, I have to expound on that and just say, that's something that has definitely changed the game for me. I started listening to podcasts probably about 10 or 12 years ago. I got hooked as well. And one of my favorites is the School of Greatness podcast. And one of the questions that he always asks on there is about gratitude. And I remember, you have to hear something like 45 times before you'll actually take action on it. But after I had listened so much to like positive things and personal development, I guess you could say, like as I got more and more ingrained into that mindset, I decided to take the advice that he gave once on a podcast, and I decided to implement. It was a New Year's resolution, I think circa 2009. And it was like, every day I'm going to write down something I'm grateful for. And I'm going to do it in the morning, and I'm going to do it when I go to bed at night. And the first probably year, 6 months to a year, I wouldn't say that my mindset changed, right? It wasn't like because of doing that, I was just this positive person all the time. But I've been doing that ever since. And I've done it every single day for however long it's been, 12, 13 years. And now it's just so much easier. Like when you do face a hardship, or you do have one of those days that just nothing's going right, that in itself has retrained my brain to say, but look how much I have to be grateful for. And so if you're listening to this and you're thinking like, where do I begin? I feel like I'm in such a rut, or I feel like I'm going crazy, which is something I say to myself, moms, we say that all the time. If that's you, it sounds so simple and so silly, but it really can make all the difference to just start writing down what you're grateful for, and let that practice and that journaling activity really help retrain your brain. I say that from my own experience. So to wrap us up today, before we point people in your direction, I'd love to hear, what are you grateful for right now?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Health, I see that every day. One of my jobs is working at the breast health clinic and breaking the diagnosis of breast cancer at least 2 or 3 times a shift. And I see, these words that I utter from my mouth, you have breast cancer, has robbed them of the next year of their life, right? They're going to be fine. Most of them are going to have a happy, lovely life afterwards, but what I've given them is an uphill battle to go on, right? And I've given it to women much younger than me. And you sometimes wonder, like, what is this roulette game of life that health is? And I think it just shows you that without health, it's really hard. It's really, really hard too. So I think every day that, myself, I'm healthy, my kids are healthy, that is a huge, huge blessing. And I'm extremely thankful for my spouse, my husband, my partner, who appreciates and recognizes this spark that I have in me to speak and to write and to do something beyond the four walls of a medical clinic, right? And then that's okay. Even though you might train in one area, it is okay to pursue something a little bit different. And I think that's a lesson that I want to teach to my kids too, that keep that hope and dream alive and doing things like this. I'm grateful for platforms that I can share my message and have these amazing conversations with people that I would have never met otherwise. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And I was just telling my husband yesterday, we were talking about our kids, and I said so much about helping our children really comes back to what we model to them, right? It's all about what we model to them. And so if you feel like your children are struggling, you know, or whatever, like take that self-reflection moment and say, what am I struggling with? Because they are seeing something in themselves that they've seen in me. So I love that. And I love what you're grateful for. I mean, I always say, if we don't have our health, we have nothing. I've experienced that firsthand with when my dad got his diagnosis when I was 12 years old. It was a life rocking moment, right? And that can happen to any of us in a split second. So being grateful for our health, being grateful for our relationships, being grateful for this life we've been given, totally retrains the brain. So I've loved our conversation today, as always. I'm so grateful that you've taken time to be with us. I would love for you to point people in your direction. Where can they find you? All that good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So website, drshahana.com, Instagram at the Dr. Shahana, and on Facebook at Dr. Shahana as well. So come send me a message, say hi, would love to connect and chat and continue this great conversation.
Excellent. I'll make sure to link all that up in the show notes for you guys. So all you have to do is swipe up to get all those links. But thank you again, my friend, for being here. I know we'll talk soon.
Anytime. Take care.